afternoon. I'm Carrie at the Mass State University Librarian. It's great to see many of you here. In fact, I know quite a few of you, I believe. Good show of library staff, as well as many others across campus. I'm pleased to introduce Candace Thill as this afternoon's speaker in an ongoing series about teaching and learning in the digital environment. And I can't think of a more prepared person to speak in this arena as Dr. Thill. Dr. Thill is a founding director of Open Learning Initiative, and it was started at Carnegie Mellon, and then it went with you when you went to Stanford. She is also an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education, and in addition to many really impressive accomplishments, I thought this one was significant. It might not be the most significant, that Dr. Thill served on a working group of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology for the Obama administration, and helped produce a report entitled Engage to Excel. And I think you'll probably talk about some of that work, or extension of that work. It's said that before there were MOOCs, there was Candace Thill. So we look forward to your comments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thill.
Thank you. Thank you. Probably the other role that I serve on currently that might be appropriate to this group is I'm also on the board of directors for the AAC&U. So I think a lot about liberal education and the role of digital technologies in liberal education too. The Engage to Excel report was really a focus on STEM learning. So I just wanted to sort of say that I have credits in both domains. Anyway, so what I was going to talk about today briefly actually is science, learning, technology, and then what I want to have a conversation with all of us in the room is something that I've really been thinking a lot about lately at Stanford, and encouraging my colleagues at Stanford to think a lot about, which is what is the role of elite universities like Brown, and if I should be so arrogant to say like Stanford, in the current transformation of what's going on in higher education. So I'm hoping that what I want to do is just kind of set a little foundational thoughts, and what I really want is a conversation with all of you who are thinking about this. Okay, so just briefly, Harriet mentioned the Open Learning Initiative. What it is it's open. That's what the O stands for, not online, even though a lot of people think it's online. The open online learning environments based on the integration of what the affordances are of the current technology with the art and the science of teaching and learning. And we designed the project to do two things simultaneously. Both support teaching, and part of that, which is improved learning, but then also to facilitate learning research. And I'll talk a little bit about that more today. I've been generously supported by a number of foundations, the National Science Foundation, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Lumina Foundation, the Walter S. Johnson Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and the Spencer Foundation. So I'm just get right to, when I say the science of learning, we have a long history. Do I have learning researchers in the room? Great. So we have a long history of doing research on human learning and publishing results that then we wonder why practitioners don't pick up those results and change their teaching practice in a way that would give them students better supportive learning when we've made it really clear how they need to do that. There's a lot of tension out there now about how do we get faculty in particular to stop lecturing at people and start doing some of these things that we know will facilitate learning. So what we did instead of attempting to try and tell faculty, do this differently, was build in to the learning environment, design these web-based learning environments in such a way that they built in some of the principles that we had extracted from the learning research. But then we also use the environments to collect data to refine our understanding of the learning research. So it's a kind of continuous cycle. So to give you an example, one of the really common things that we know from years of learning is that goal-directed practice and targeted feedback enhances the quality of the student's learning. So rather than just my explaining to you what to do, giving you an opportunity to try it, and then while you're trying it, get support and feedback. So I'll just give you a quick example. And I didn't know what kind of domains I was going to have in the room, so I just picked one out of our engineering statics course. Engineers? How many engineers? Great. So statics is a sophomore level engineering course. And this is an example of a kind of activity we can do in an online environment. So those of you who are engineers will look at this and go, of course, I know how to do this. Those of you who are not, or who took engineering when you were younger, might feel, oh my gosh, I can't believe I have to look at this right now. So it's easy. Determine the sum of these 3 concurrent forces. And so basically we ask them a simple question. What's the magnitude of the sum? What's the direction and sense of the vector? And so they can just type in the answer and move on. If they're not sure what to do, or if they type in the answer and it's wrong, they'll get immediate feedback. If it's not sure they're not sure what to do, they always have this hint button that says, help me, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Now, in this particular case, this particular activity appears in the courseware where we would have expected the student would be able to just do this problem. So we kind of give them a little prompt that says, the purpose of this activity is for you to assess whether or not you can do this. So before we help you, you want to give it a try on your own. If you still think you need some help, go ahead and ask, and you can click there, and the system will give you some help. So if they click there, the system says, well, remember, the first step you want to take is to resolve each of these forces into their components. Can you do that? So again, this is, okay, for force 1, type it in. If I'm still stuck there, I can ask for another hint. And it reminds me that what I'm supposed to be thinking about there. Now I can go, as you can see, there's a get next hint. So there's multiple levels of hint that the student can ask for, even on just this substep. And the hints are designed to support the students to engage in the thought process we want them to be engaging in when they're trying to solve this problem. So how many of you have heard by learn by doing? Okay, everyone say, make your kids learn by doing. That's great, but actually what we really mean by learn by doing is learn by thinking. So do something, have the students do something that's going to trigger the thought process we want them to engage in. So we structure these hints to try and, while they're doing this project, to try and sort of scaffold their thinking about how should I be thinking about approaching this problem. So the student can get multiple levels of hint, as I said, until they get to, in this case, the 3rd level hint, which we call the bottom-out hint, which you probably call the answer. And they can just type in 7.49, okay? So they can keep going. But then they'll get to the next force, and they'll have to go through essentially the same process. And hopefully they don't need to go through all those levels of hint to get the second one and the third one. So they have 6 chances to exercise that process. And so how many of you are a little worried that what your students would do is go, okay, hint, 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 type in the answer. Hint, 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 type in the answer. Okay. Yeah, so some, yes. So, and students do that. The difference is, we know. So, and some students do that for productive reasons. They really don't get how to do this, and they're essentially using the hinting structure as a worked example. They're constructing a worked example for themselves. Some are doing it because they already know it, and so but just kind of thinking it through is not where they want to spend their time. So just give me the answer so I can move on. And so there are all kinds of different reasons, and we could talk about all those different things we've learned about the patterns that we see about why students do that, but I wasn't going to go into that much. In any case, I'm not going to bore you with the whole thing, but you can see the student has finished this part. They get to it, so now they have essentially completed the problem. They may have asked for lots of hints and feedbacks along the way, but the system says it's great that you're able to do this, but we would have expected that you could have done this without all of the help and support we just gave you. So if you want to, press this button and you can get another problem child. So what this essentially offers the learner is 24/7 support in this particular problem-solving process. And so that's what I mean about goal-directed practice and targeted feedback supports this learner. So as you might see, so in OLI version 1.1, version 1.0, which is what I was doing at Carnegie Mellon, we got a lot of power out of doing this, kind of taking these complex cognitive tasks and deconstructing them into their knowledge components, and then figuring out how to create these guided learning activities with targeted hints and feedback to scaffold the learners to be able to gain fluency in these various tasks. Okay? And we did lots of research showing the power of this approach. This one was probably the one that got the most press. This was an accelerated learning study we did back in 2008. And the reason we did that study, frankly, was because my funder, Mike Smith from the Hewlett Foundation, came after we produced all this stuff, and I was happy to show him that we've done studies showing students using the OLI courseware did as well or better than students sitting in a traditional course, learning, say, introductory statistics, because that's what the original goal had been. And he said to me, okay, Candace, that's interesting, sort of. You know, of all this stuff you're telling me, which is doing this sort of complex cognitive task analysis, giving the students 24/7 support, targeted hints and feedback, all of that is true. Why didn't the students using the OLI courseware do better than the students sitting in the class at Carnegie Mellon? And I tried to, if you would, try to explain how difficult it is to measure learning gain and how social science, you know, is an accumulation of evidence, all that kind of stuff. And he was kind of like, yeah. Show me better. And I said, how am I supposed to show you better? And he said, well, how about faster? Show me students using the OLI courseware can achieve the same level of learning as the students sitting in the comparable course at Carnegie Mellon faster. And then he threw in the kicker, which is you do that study and I'll give you more funding. So it's like, okay. And so we did. So we did this accelerated learning study. And what we did was for students that were enrolled in the introductory statistics course at Carnegie Mellon, they were actually my university would not let me just randomly assign them to condition off of the roster. But what they did let me do was announce the study to the learners, have the learners volunteer to be in the study, and then from those who volunteered for the study, I could randomly assign them to condition. So we did that. We had the students volunteer and took a bunch of demographic information about the learners so that we could make sure, and randomly assign them to condition, and then look to make sure that the two groups were not in any significant way different. And I actually had two control conditions, because I had the students who volunteered for the study and were assigned the control condition. And then I also had the students who were in the class who hadn't volunteered for the study. So they were a second control condition, a control to my control to make sure that my control was not different than the other students. So we essentially did the study where all the students, so the students in the accelerated OLI group, I should say that the regular class at Carnegie Mellon for introductory statistics is 15 weeks with 4 class meetings a week. That's pretty traditional, right? In the OLI accelerated condition, the students only took the class for 8 weeks with only 2 class meetings a week. So it was half the elapsed time and a quarter of the instructor contact hours. And these were regularly enrolled students taking a full load in all their other classes, et cetera. And the upshot was, and they all had 3 midterms and a final. And the upshot was the students in the OLI accelerated condition did as well or better than the students in either control condition. And we did pre-test and post-tests on all students, even the students who hadn't volunteered to be in the study. And the faculty member, who was the faculty member of record on the accelerated study, when he agreed to be the faculty member in that, he said to me, this isn't going to work. And it's not going to work because my students learn in relationship with me. And if I'm only seeing them for half a semester and only 2 times a week, we're not going to have the chance to build that relationship. It's not going to work. At the end of the accelerated study, he said to me, this is the best experience I've had in my 15 years of teaching introductory statistics. And I was like, okay, why? And he said, well, for the first time, when the students came into class, they knew what they knew and what they didn't know. I knew what they knew and what they didn't know. But probably most importantly, they knew that I knew what they knew and what they didn't know. So when we only had we had a smaller amount of time, but we spent that time incredibly aligned with where they are and where they're trying to get to. So he felt he had insight into his students that he didn't get when he would sort of just see their work at midterms and finals. So in any case, so we got a, and then Bill Bowen, the former president of Princeton and the head of the Ithaca Foundation, saw this result and then wanted to see, okay, it's great that it works at Carnegie Mellon, could it work at other institutions? So he did a large-scale study in the University of Maryland system and then the SUNY system in New York to look at, they couldn't get the same permission for the same kind of acceleration, but they did a version of the study and got some results. Okay, so we did great, but we weren't getting, so the OLI courseware was used in institutions with pretty much any Carnegie classification you can think of. But we weren't getting those kinds of results everywhere. You know, this cognitive task analysis worked pretty well, but what we learned was that's not everything that we have to think about when we're thinking about supporting learning. That the challenge that institutions of higher education are being asked to address right now is not only more students, but a much greater diversity of students. And I don't just mean diversity in the dimensions that most people think of, you know, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity. All of those forms of diversity are important, but I'm also talking about diversity which we have in our classroom, where students are showing up with a much greater diversity in their background knowledge, in their relevant skills, and in their goals. So if I'm trying to teach a much more diverse class with the same tools that I've had in the past, it's really hard to do. And not only that kind of diversity, but then we also, so when I came to Stanford, I started working with my colleagues like Harold Dweck around academic mindset, or Jeff Cohen around social belongingness, and recognized also the diversity in how the students explain or make sense of the feedback and the meaning that they're making out of their experience. So now at like the academic mindset. So now I'm bringing to bear not just the cognitive science in the design of the environment, but also some of the social psychological science, like on mindset and social belonging or stereotype threat. And I could be happy to talk a little bit more if people are interested in how we're building that into the environment. But now I want to stop talking because I wanted to hear what you guys think. So whenever I'm talking to groups about, I usually get brought in as the ed tech person. Technology is going to disrupt, transform, do something to higher education. And I always like to know kind of what the prior knowledge or thinking is in the room so that we know where to have that conversation. So usually when I ask people, how is technology going to transform higher education? What are the affordances of that technology that are really powerful? I get one of three answers. So I'm going to ask you guys what you think, okay? So these are pretty much the three answers I get. This is the big one. This is what MOOCs really capitalized on. Access and convenience. If you have a computer, a laptop, a mobile device, you can learn anytime, any place. That's the big power of these technologies. Access and convenience. Other people say, okay, yeah, that's important, but since I've listened to you and saw your little demo of this sort of engineering statics tutor and stuff, no, it's really about what you can do with the computer that you cannot do in a face-to-face classroom. So the simulation capabilities of the computer. If you're teaching, for example, engineering, I could have you build a bridge. The bridge collapses and nobody gets killed. I could put you into simulation environments where you can have experiences that it's just too difficult for us to create in the classroom. So that sort of simulation capability of the computer. The third one is it's not about the individual and the computer. It's about that what this computer really is a big connection device. With the computer, we can connect our learners to other learners, to other experts, to the world. It's this connection and crowdsourcing capability. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you. by show of hands, which one you think is the biggest power. If you're a betting person, you are going to bet on, this is the one that we're going to place our bet on. Which one would you go with? Okay. How many think it's access and convenience? That's really where it is. Raise your hands. Be proud of your vote. Okay. How many people say, no, I thought that thing you showed us was pretty compelling. It's about the simulation capability. Okay, cool. And then how about, no, you guys are all old. You guys are all thinking in the 90s. It's about connection. How many people? Okay, how many of you are thinking, Candace, you are in the Graduate School of Education. What are you doing giving us a crummy multiple-choice test? How many of you wanted me to add those other things we usually put on multiple-choice tests? All of the above. Yeah. How many of you wanted me to put none of the above? Okay, so how many of you just don't raise your hands when you're asked to raise your hand? So anyway, I agree with you. Okay, all of these are important. But actually, if I were taking this test, I would have picked none of the above. Because what I think the power is of these technologies in terms of transforming education is what Google has already figured out. It's what Netflix has figured out. It's what Amazon has figured out. The power of these technologies is not using them to push stuff out, but to push stuff to the interface. Because in the interface, we can observe the user. Now, Netflix, Amazon, Google, they are observing us all of the time. Why? Why are they observing our interactions with their interfaces?
Sales.
Yeah, sales. They're observing us as consumers. They want to know how to target what they're doing better to us as individual consumers and to consumers as a group. And so you all might be thinking, that is really creepy, Candace. You know, that you're now thinking about education as a consumer good. So let me say I'm not thinking about it that way. I do not think education is a consumer good. And we can have a big conversation about that. But I am talking about that idea of observing the user in the interface. Because by observing them, if we design the environments properly, we can observe them not as consumers, but as learners. Both so that we can understand that individual learner better, and also so we can understand learners in general better. And that's what I actually call my killer app. This idea that we construct these learning environments so that as the students are interacting with them, we are collecting data. And we use that student learning data to drive these very powerful feedback loops in the larger learning system. So I already talked a little bit about the way we can use that to give feedback to the students about their performance. We can also use that to give feedback to the instructor. So this is the older version of the instructor dashboard. We've got a new one that's coming, but I'll show you this one because it's easy to illustrate. So this is out of an introductory statistics course. This is an actual screen capture of a faculty member's learning dashboard. This tells us in this module, examining distributions, there are 6 learning goals that we want students to achieve. You'll notice that the learning goals are stated in student-centered and observable ways. Like we don't say, do they understand sampling distribution? How could we know? So we say something like, can they summarize and describe the distribution of a categorical variable in context? And what this bar is telling me is the prediction for my class. So I actually teach data analysis and interpretation at Stanford, and I teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And I tell my students, work through this module by Monday night at 10 o'clock, because we're meeting Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. And I need time between when you finish working to look at what the system is predicting for me about your knowledge state, so that I can plan what I'm going to do in class based on where you guys are. So if this were my dashboard, what this would be telling me is the students in green, that's making a prediction that based on their interactions, if I were to give them, if they walked in and I gave them a pop quiz or an assessment or a task that required them to summarize and describe the distribution of a categorical variable in context, my class would nail it. Okay, the gold or the orange means moderate. Red means those students are struggling. Anybody got an idea what gray means? Yeah, they haven't done enough work in the system for the model that's driving the prediction to make a reliable prediction. That doesn't mean they haven't done anything. They just haven't, on that particular learning outcome, they haven't done enough to beat the model to make a prediction. Okay, so here I am, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. I can look at that and I can say, okay, I'm not going to spend any time talking about those top two. We're going to spend a lot of time here. I might, if I have a little more time, want to click in a little bit and say what actually is going on there. So I can click in and I can see for any student, each dot represents a student. For any student, I can see actually their names. Who are the students that are in the moderate learning level? And how many activities did they attempt that's feeding that prediction? I removed the names because, for obvious reasons. I also can look at that particular larger outcome has several sub-skills. This is what I was saying about deconstructing complex tasks into sub-skills. Has some sub-skills, and so I can look at the distribution for those students on those sub-skills. And so I can say, okay, they're struggling with relating the measures of center and spread to the shape of a distribution and choosing the appropriate measure in different contexts. One of the things they might be really struggling with is they don't really get how to compute the median. So it's like, okay, so I can give a task or have a conversation that targets that. I could actually go even a little further, clicking on that and see the actual activities in which they engaged, which is driving that prediction about their ability to compute the median. So I can see where they actually, are they confusing the median with the mode? Did they forget to put the digits in order before they pick the center one? Like, if I have more time, the system will support me to really understand where they're struggling. Okay. Then, of course, that's feedback. So the individual learner gets feedback based on their interactions. The instructor gets that feedback based on the interactions of their students with the courseware. The OLI courses are not designed by individual faculty. They're designed by teams of faculty, like statisticians if we're teaching statistics, but also software engineers, learning science folks, instructional design people, universal design for learning people. That's a whole group of people that are bringing together their expertise to co-design this environment. So I mentioned that the OLI environments get used in institutions of every kind of Carnegie classification. So the data for your class, if you were using it, Harry, goes to you. The data on your class and on the 60 other classes of every Carnegie classification that was using the OLI statistics course last quarter goes to the design team, so that we can identify where in the courseware do we miss? Are we not supporting learners? Do we need to refine our understanding? Okay, and then the last group that it goes to are the learning researchers. So as I mentioned, all of the design is based on what we think we know about human learning based on our research. But when we're collecting this data from student interactions, it can also refine our understanding of human learning. So there are activities that we design in the statistics courseware or in the chemistry courseware or in the logic courseware or in the French courseware that are based on some fundamental hypothesis about human learning. And so the learning researchers get that data from all the different kinds of courseware that are essentially contributing evidence towards that hypothesis about learning that's embedded in that design. And that actually takes care of one of the goals of science of learning is to describe, explain, and predict student learning. And historically, the way we've done that has been a little bit, hasn't been really quite robust. So I think some of the challenges that we see of not translating research into practice comes partly from how we do the research. So one way that we do learning research is sort of randomized trials or lab studies where we have a particular hypothesis about often how memory works. And we bring students in, we have a well-constructed experiment that controls a lot of variables so we can essentially refine, confirm, provide evidence for our hypothesis about how memory works. Unfortunately, often then we say, oh, look, it's space practice, and then this is how you do it. When it gets out into the real world, where we're not controlling all of those messy variables that are really part of the learning environment, you don't see the same effect. So that's a real challenge. The other kinds of studies we've historically done in education are classroom studies, where you go in for a long period of time and observe a classroom over a long period of time. Again, people have great pilot studies where they'll say, oh, this faculty member did this differently instead of that, and it's great. And then the next faculty member kind of tries to do that, and it doesn't work. And oftentimes with classroom studies, they have the advantage of being more authentic, but they have the disadvantage is there's so many things going on that it's hard to know if you're trying to make a causal claim what the underlying mechanism or interaction of mechanisms were that actually produced the result. So sometimes when you try to replicate it someplace else and it doesn't work, it's because you didn't really capture what it was that was working. So I submit to you that what these web-based learning environments give us is the best of both worlds. We can construct the environment so that, based on learning theory, and then the environments are used in authentic contexts where real students are really trying to learn stuff, and we can collect the data to refine our theory, because we can much more tightly control a lot of the variables or account for a lot of the variables in the web-based environment. And that leads me to what I think is really where we're going in this space, which is we've had this way of doing learning research, which is starting from our theory, constructing testable hypotheses, and that works well. Now we have these new tools, which is educational data mining, where we're looking at relationships in the data. But what we really need, neither of those alone will get us very far. What we really need is to bring both of those together so that we can build these better explanatory and predictive models of human learning. And that leads me to what I think is really the power of these technologies to transform higher education, which is setting up this virtuous cycle, where we start with, you can start any place here, but if we start with our learning theory, or our models of how people learn, and we use that to design the learning experience in the educational technology, then we use the technology for what it's really good for, which is collecting data, and then we analyze the data to refine our theories and models, and then use our refined theories and models to redesign the environments, then we set up this virtuous cycle of continuous improvement. And my argument about one of the things that we have in higher education that no other sector has is the ability to do this rapidly. Why? Especially places like Brown. Because in every other industry, the way tech transfer happens is what I would call the suboptimal linear technology transfer model, where the researchers are doing their research, they come up, they publish their results, their findings, and kind of gets thrown out to the practitioners who try and interpret that research and put it into practice, often not working so well, or you have to depend on the sort of translational research. We have the benefit of having the practitioners and the researchers co-located. So rather than my designing some interesting little research lab study that I think would be interesting to refine my theory of learning, and then hoping that you, humanities faculty, will pick it up and do something with it in your class, we can have a conversation. And we can say, okay, in your history class, what are you struggling with? Where is it that students aren't getting what you want them to get in the way that you want them to get it? Where are the real challenges? And then we can co-create, a history professor can co-create an intervention that does two things. It helps hopefully address that particular pedagogical challenge at the same time that it helps me refine a particular aspect of learning. that some of that code creation means we don't have to put up with this suboptimal linear technology transfer model. So I'm just going to end with 2 quotes, and then I want to have this conversation. And this is the quote that is, I think, going to stimulate our conversation. William Baumol, who was an economist, back in 1967, said, "Without a complete revolution in our approach to teaching, we cannot go beyond our current levels of productivity." When I used to use this quote a year or 2 ago, I used to say, "Such a revolution is possible." I don't say that anymore. What I say now is, "Such a revolution is happening." But my question is still the same. Who's going to lead it? Who's going to lead this revolution? Where is it being led now? And who's going to lead it? The second quote is from another economist, actually, Herb Simon, Carnegie Mellon, who said improvement, another Nobel laureate, who said improvement in post-secondary education will require teaching from a solo sport to a community-based research activity. I have modified Herb's quote to say improvement in post-secondary education will require converting teaching and courseware, platform, and analytic system development from a solo sport to a community-based research activity. So my point is, I'm inviting you to participate in this community-based research activity and step up and take a lead in this transformation. So that's where I'm going to stop. And now I want controversial conversation.
It just strikes me that you're doing very much what, with technology, what design people talk about, the value of user-centered design.
Yes.
And my son once gave a lecture in Singapore to the whole computer science department about basically user-centered computer design instead of doing it first and then going out and try to find a user to buy it.
Yes.
And it seems to me this is what we're all trying to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. User-centered design. But it's a little, but there's another piece to it. Because in a user-centered design for a product, in some ways, what you're trying to do is get the user to be able to use the product effectively. We're trying to get them to learn things effectively, but we also have sort of a goal beyond just the effective use of the product. And that's the other thing that I think people aren't getting, is that if we outsource the design of these environments, we're outsourcing also the goals that those environments are attempting to support our students to achieve. And it's a little different. I would argue that it's different than textbooks. I mean, I think part of the reason that a lot of faculty aren't sort of jumping up and saying, no, we need to be having a strong voice in this, is because we've gotten used to using other materials to support our teaching over time. The difference here, I would argue, is that the materials themselves are now enacting more of the teaching. They are making pedagogical decisions by that predictive modeling that I was talking about we design the systems to do. So, and a lot of people think that since a computer is doing it, it must be neutral. It's not. You know, as you know, anybody who does design, it's going to be built into the tool is going to be the biases of whoever is doing the design. Or if it's a pure machine learning algorithm where we're just giving it huge amounts of data and telling the system to classify it or find the patterns, then the bias will be introduced by whose data you are running those classifications on. So if it's not representative, then we're going to get bias introduced that way. So these algorithms, what factors to consider, how you weight the factors, those are all how you even the modeling algorithms you choose are all decisions. And so what slays me actually is I feel a little bit like we're getting pushed back into the earlier times where we're in the realm of alchemy. You know, where a lot of these ed tech providers are saying, trust us. I can predict your students' competence on statistics. Don't worry your pretty little head about how I can make that prediction. Just trust me, I can make it. And I would argue that unless those predictive models and the factors that we're using are not peer reviewable, are not transparent, are not open to academic scrutiny, then we are back in alchemy instead of science. So I'm a big push on not just open educational resources, but open and transparent models.
Just a quick comment based on the slides you showed before and the Amazon and Netflix examples that we talked about. I feel like where this is all going, at least in my opinion, is really it's personalization of learning
Yes.
through interaction, and that's leading to an adaptive learning, sharing, teaching ecosystem.
Yes, that's exactly what people will call these, is personalized adaptive learning environments. But adapting how, to what goal, personalizing to who. People talk about adaptive personalized learning without unpacking what do we really mean.
And in my opinion, it's really driven by the learners. The learners are driving it. I mean, when you talked about the laptops and other things being used, a lot of times laptops are dying now. It's down to smartphones that are being used for adaptive learning, and that's why people are even talking about, is web going to be dead?
Yes, so the learners, and this is again a really interesting question about what's the role of in the higher education system, what's the role of the learner, what's the role of the faculty member, what's the role of the institution? And I think that we are in a process where those roles are being renegotiated. And what's the role of the technology in facilitating that shift in roles is another question. I mean, what's interesting to me about having this be, I'm all for learner-centered design, but that doesn't mean that, we can count on the learners to, one thing I know from our research is that especially like freshmen, sophomores are terrifically bad at being able to know when they've learned something. Their metacognitive skills are not that great. So you can ask them, do you prefer this way of learning or this way of learning? Which worked better for you? And they will tell you, and they will believe, oh, I like this better, it works better for me, and they're wrong when you actually assess what it is you want them to be able to learn. So while I'm a big fan of having students on our design teams, I'm not a big fan of having this be completely designed by the learner. Yeah.
First off, thank you for the presentation. And towards your last question, like who will lead this change? So I'm a senior graduating and really interested in ed tech and this specifically. How would you suggest I get into this, whether it be grad school or working with a company like
Great. This is how you as an individual would get into it, and then how an institution would get into it. I would argue that what institutions need to do, and then this has where the role for individuals to be, because right now, for most individuals who care and want to do something such as you're doing, you feel like my choices are go to one of these ed tech startups, because that's where people are actually doing stuff. And so that is obviously a choice. But I would encourage universities care about education to actually start thinking about this as part of their core business process. And you invest in co-creating these things in the same way that you would invest in any other part of your core mission, and not purely outsource it to the commercial sector. And not necessarily invest in it in the same way that we historically, this is the rub, is that these environments are really expensive to create. They're resource intensive. And do we need Brown and Stanford and Rhode Island, University of Rhode Island to all be creating their own introductory statistics piece of courseware? So we don't need 4,000 institutions, about 4,500 institutions in the US. We don't need 4,500 different versions of all of these courseware. It's not economically feasible, and it's also not the best way to do it, because then you'll be designing it, again, for a very limited population. So what I think we need to do is, and that doesn't mean we need one piece of courseware either. But we need somewhere between 1 and 4,500. And I don't know what the right number is, but I do believe that the process should be that institutions find partners and co-create things and you co-create the environment for both using at your own institution and having the other partner using it at their institution, and then committing to collecting the data and analyzing and improving it as a collab. That's what I mean about a collaborative, community-based research activity. And that particular approach is kind of hard historically for higher education. Although on the research side of the house, there's a lot of precedent for people putting together multi-institutional research partnerships. So we just kind of need to shift that thinking to apply to the teaching side of the house too. But I didn't answer your specific question. So you can find an institution that is moving in that direction to be part of that. If Brown is doing any kind of development, I would strongly encourage you with your student voice to be part of what's being developed. That's incredibly important. I said I don't want students completely designing it, but student voice is incredibly important. And you're Black, so you also need to have a perspective that you have from having grown up a Black person in this country. And you're a woman, and so you have a perspective that you got from you're growing up as a woman in this country. And I don't know what other identities, those are the identities I can immediately associate with you, but I don't know what other identities. But the point is that we need multiple perspectives from multiple identities and multiple experiences co-creating these environments so that they work for a large number of students.
So I'm going to fight with myself as I ask this question.
Okay,
but the question of financial sustainability comes to mind
Yes.
when higher ed is already in danger.
Yes.
I mean, this is a reorientation of everything. And how could this be sustained? I mean, maybe you would say, how can we sustain if we don't do this? But how do you deal with that question?
Yeah, so, it's interesting because I think on one of my first slides, I show all the foundations who were generous enough to give me a lot of money over the years to do this. And they're not, foundations are rapidly becoming tired of giving money to not-for-profit higher education. In fact, some foundations notably are now investing in the for-profit ed tech sector because they believe that that's really where the innovation is going to come from. I disagree with them. I argue with them all the time on that, but I still think they're running. So I would say, don't try and do it all immediately. Find on any one of our campuses, there's going to be a place where the department, the faculty are kind of interested in moving in this direction and just need the institutional support and, in some ways, permission to experiment and take it on as an innovation research practice. And then find other institutions that have faculty in that similar area who are interested in doing it. I really think that's where it's gonna kind of start. I think that there are very few institutions that have the financial resources to say, we're gonna just reinvent our institution whole scale this way. I mean, there are some that are kind of trying it, like Arizona State University is investing a lot in being a big power in this. Georgia State actually is a big in this. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. Unfortunately, when I was at Carnegie Mellon and I got all this foundation support to build these things, and I went around saying to groups just like this is a community-based research activity. It's an open educational resource. Commit your time and energy, and we're creating a public good for everyone to use. And so it did kind of break my heart that when I left Carnegie Mellon, the then provost and president spun out a for-profit company to continue to deliver the OLI courseware. Now the new president and provost are back to the other perspective. So they're going to start open sourcing the OLI environment and make it available again as an open educational resource. But there is always that risk of, and I understood where the old administration was coming from, exactly this question. How are we going to sustain this? I think that there are ways you can sustain it that aren't hugely expensive. I mean, if you have large numbers of students using this resource, and they're currently paying $150 or $200 a piece for a textbook, and you ask them to pay $25 for use of the resource, when you get thousands of students, you start to get some money. It's a volume game. Yeah.
So a question about another piece of the incentive to get this done, or the challenge to move in this direction. So we, the committee that I was telling you about earlier, did a survey of our faculty recently, and the results of the survey indicate that the pretty large majority of the faculty don't believe that engaging in this kind of effort is important or relevant to their fields. And they're also very, very busy people. They're on assignment to do the things that they're doing, researching and teaching. So to me, that feels like even a bigger barrier than the financial barrier, which is gigantic, as you just described, to transition in this direction. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, so that was the case at Carnegie Mellon. I mean, I was when we first started doing OLI, and I should tell you, when we first started doing OLI at Carnegie Mellon, you'll find this a little entertaining. When I was going around to the different departments, because I was starting with departments saying who wants to play, to a department that agreed to be part of the original project, the statement was pretty much this: okay, Candace, we're happy to do this interesting research and experiment and create this gift from Carnegie Mellon to the world. But let's be really clear. These environments that we're building will never be used to teach our students here at Carnegie Mellon, because that's just not how we do things here. I'm seeing a lot of head nodding. So every single one of these environments are now used at Carnegie Mellon. And in fact, what happened is, as the faculty started to use these, because we built them, but then we had to test them, and where do we test them? Oh, well, let's test them here. And the faculty got to see the difference in the experience that they had with their learners by using this process of having the learners work in these environments instead of doing whatever else I was having them do outside of class, and then having them come into class. The kinds of conversations, the kinds of work we can do with the students in class was very different. And that's really what shifted things for people. And also the fact, and I didn't start with the faculty resistors. And the other thing was, for the faculty that were involved in the project, it very much keyed into the research side of their brain. Because you can think of everything that we're designing as a hypothesis. And then we collect the data and we see, did it work? And then we can refine it. And so if you kind of reframe this from just, we're investing in just teaching, to we're investing in understanding how the students that we care about really understand the domain that I care about, then it's a different game. I mean, a lot of the faculty, you can see why the learning researchers would care to participate. You might say, why would a biology faculty member care? I would say that the thing about the faculty that participated in this project at Carnegie Mellon was they loved their discipline. I've been thinking particularly of the biology faculty member. He just thought that the biology, the way he understood it, was beautiful. And it would frustrate him and make him really unhappy that his students would come into class and they didn't see it that way. They just saw it as, I have to pass this midterm, I'm trying to get to medical school, whatever it is I'm trying to do. And he just wanted them to stop and see what he saw in it. And he didn't know how to get that to happen. That was really that was part of his motivation. The other part of his motivation is, we got students, and I'm sure this happens around too, I should use past tense because I'm not at Carnegie Mellon anymore, but we got really top tier students. Scored really well on the SATs, great GPAs, coming in to say introductory biology by all counts should just nail it. And what he was finding was the biology that they could nail was biology the way that he would have taught it 10 years ago. Why? Because they're learning it in high schools where it's being taught the way the people who learned it 10 years ago. And so part of his motivation was trying to provide a resource that could reach back, and so that he could have students that were ready to engage with biology the way he wanted to engage with biology. So there are different. Part of it is not just thinking of faculty as a monolithic group, but the faculty that want to do something they're going to be all different reasons. And I think the key in the success we had at OLI was really engaging with the faculty to understand what challenge are they having, what goal do they have, what vision do they have, and how does that complement what it is we're trying to achieve. And if you have sort of shared and meaningful goals, and it's really clear that faculty members' goals can be better met by being part of this than trying to do it their own way all by themselves, then you're going to have a game. If not, you don't have a game.
So it still suggests that we do this one course at a time. Is that from your point of view, thinking about higher ed on the national or international level, is that actually sustainable and sensible? And what about, I mean, I think in part we believe here that we can keep doing things the way we've been doing them because we've been very, very successful at that, and there's no reason not to.
Yes, and you know, that there's the reason people at Brown think that is probably because it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I do believe that what I'm afraid is happening in higher education is a tremendous bifurcation, where there'll be a handful of institutions, and Brown likely will be one of them, Stanford likely will be one of them, that can still do higher education the way we think of higher education. And then there's going to be this the 98% that are going to have a higher education experience that isn't something that I think any of us in this room would think of as what we think of as the mission of higher education. And so part of my thing is my mission in life is to stop that bifurcation from happening. But my second mission is, if I can't stop it from happening, to try and figure out how to make that 98% be as rich and robust and as close to the true mission and value of higher education as the people who are privileged enough to come to Stanford and Brown will get. So, and I do think that even though we're at Stanford and Brown, I do feel a bit of an obligation to not just say, oh, well, I hope the rest of higher education can figure this out. Because I do think that it is going to be our institutions that are going to have to participate in helping to figure it out.
If that bifurcation happens, sorry, just to go on for one more question, but if that bifurcation happens and it is as dramatic as you described, 98% to 2, will there really be 2% of the students who want to continue to learn in this kind of model if all the rest of the world looks so different to them?
That's another
And the
interesting
standards for completing a higher education are changed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it would be turning. I mean, do we have any historians? Okay, so it's kind of like then turning back the clock to see before how higher education used to be thought of, which was for a very select, small number of people. I mean, I guess we could go back to
antiques
that.
instead of IKEA. And
Pardon?
it's like buying antiques instead of going to IKEA. Some people do want antiques, but
But how does this address the learning that happens in creative, messy, physical experimentations?
Great.
Like art, like engineering, creativity, out of the box, when people actually learn by getting their hands stuck together with crazy glue, right?
Yes.
So I can't see it. I
Great.
mean,
Okay, great. I was waiting for someone to ask that question. That usually comes up really early. It usually gets, I like used engineering as the example, because it usually comes up with, oh, I can see how that would work for engineering statics. I do not see how it'll work in the humanities.
I don't see how it works for visual art.
Or visual art, or any of these things. Okay, so, and whenever the Chronicle of Higher Education or Inside Higher Ed, when they used to write about my work, the headline was always something like, she's trying to replace us with computers.
Right now.
And that's not what I'm trying to do. But I am trying to, and what I used to say is, frankly, any faculty member who can be replaced by a computer should be. And I stopped saying that because I got that response, which wasn't communicating what I was trying to communicate, which is what we as faculty members in creating learning experience do is so much richer than what we can currently do with the computer, that if that's all we're doing in our classes, replace us. What I'm trying to present here is a lot of the stuff that we're doing in our classes and a lot of the way that we're teaching right now is not using ourselves as a best resource, if you will. That learning is really complex. And if you want to think about creating a learning experience, you have multiple resources you can bring to bear to create that experience. So you have what a learner can do with a computer, which is changing all the time. You have what a learner can do with other learners, and then you have what a learner can do with an expert. And then there are probably, and then what I think about is not which one's better, but how do we, what are the attributes and the powers of each of those resources, and how do we combine them, given our particular context, in a way that optimizes the learning experience for that learner at this point in time, given this system. So I agree with you that there's a lot that we cannot have students experience by interacting with a computer system. And there's a lot that we can have them do with a computer system that then frees up the other resources, their peer experience, their expert experience, to have more of those kinds of experiences which we really need co-presence for. I mean, at the University of British Columbia, we're using our OLI chemistry course because they had 500 students in the intro chem course, and their problem was lab space. And so they were using the virtual lab activities in the OLI chemistry course, not to replace the lab experience, but to replace parts of the lab experience, so that the students could come into the lab experience and take much better advantage of the experience of being in the lab. And there are things that you could teach in the virtual lab much better than you teach in a regular lab, because you can more finely observe what the student is actually doing and give them support. So it's about blending the environment. I agree. We're not going to replace everything in online environments, but thinking more creatively about what can we use these environments to do. And also, my risk in showing that engineering one is people think that all I mean about the use of technology is tutoring. That was just an example. It's not, there are many technologies people are developing in all kinds of disciplines. And the one thing they all have in common is if we collect the data trail of the interactions, we can get much more insight into the student's learning trajectory. Does that address your question or no?
I just see so much learning. I work individual art department. I'm not a faculty member, but I see the students learning so much by doing what's not expected of them.
Yes.
And the outcomes are not concrete measurables, and they're often such delightful surprises, and they're paths that we all learn from, but they're not really measurable in the same concrete way as a math problem can be.
I would, so measurable is different than observable.
Well, and even still.
And I think we can observe a lot more than we actually, using these kinds of environments than we think we can observe. And measurement implies a ranking that I don't necessarily think we want to move towards. But being able to observe a pathway or multiple pathways and be able to understand what are students getting as they're going across those pathways and how do we support them on those pathways, that's more observable. Yeah, but I don't want to get rid of, I'm not trying to get rid of spontaneity or creativity at all.
I think I'm curious about the transparency, the way that you talked about that group, that you said, well, I need to let them know that I'm going to spend now, half a day analyzing their information. And there is value in that. So in that way, what you're saying now, that's where the playing begins, because you're dedicating time to look at what the students know and don't know. And then you may be able to come to class and say, hey, this is the time that we're all going to spend time on doing creative things together. So that can be a real value of things like that, even without breaking that containment. Because the other side of it is saying, well, the class system, if we really look at the way that we learn, we may now go to another class because that's the way we kind of learn. It's arbitrary sometimes and things like that. But you can still stick with the package that is tied to tenure, to money, to all of that, but still make it maybe a different experience by focusing on the way that we do it and where we put the focus on. And things. So I really like kind of the part when we can analyze the way that we work with students and put the effort in the right place, not necessarily go, like breaking the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree. And my students like it. They like it, and again, like I said, I don't just do what students like, but they like, what's interesting is they like that what they're doing outside of class has an impact on what we do inside of class. So that they like that they come into class, and I start the class by saying, well, it seems like some of you were struggling with this, and it seems like this might be where the confusion is, so let's spend some time talking about that. Or here's an activity that'll help bring that more to the face. And it feels to them more like it's, like I see them. And what's also great about it is you know how, I don't know how many of you are actually teaching classes right now, but there are always those students in the class that you know where they're coming from. They're always the ones talking, they're always the ones coming up after class, coming to office hours, and then there are all those students that are sitting there quietly, and you're not sure. What are they getting? What meaning are they making? And until you get that first paper or the midterm and you're thinking, oh my gosh, how did they make that meaning out of this? You know, and already now I'm 6 weeks in or 4 weeks into the quarter, and to try and go back and help bring that, the path for that student for the rest of the quarter is going to be hard. Whereas if I can see that meaning they're making out of it on day 2, and start to get a sense of where they're coming from, then I can much more easily think about how am I communicating this and how are they making meaning out of it. So, yeah.
I can testify using a very crude example of the kind of feedback works. For many years, I taught literature and art history courses using hypermedia, in which the students would contribute stuff, which would then, the students would then run the class. And we assume, since they're Brown students and they're using phones and tablets, they're very, very sophisticated. So my TA and I did a survey, and it turned out that they were not actually following links. They were going right to Google or to Wikipedia. And we're kind of shocked, because we had this website with what's now almost 90,000 documents contributed over the years. And we just explained to them what hypermedia was and the advantages of doing it. Then we surveyed them later on and found that suddenly, instead of using 1 or 2 links, students were using 6, 7, or 8, and the order in which they would use Google or Wikipedia or something had changed radically. And this is a very simple bit of feedback without using the computer to do it, and it had an enormous effect on the class.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good example. Yes.
Is there an equivalent initiative in K through 12?
You know, I don't actually know. Jim Shelton, when he was at the Department of Education, he was always on me. Candidates, come on, use. And I'm like, I only have so much bandwidth. And I'm actually really fascinated, mostly at the first 2 years of college. I just think that's a really fascinating time, both because of the conceptual complexity of stuff students are learning, the identity development stuff that's going on, and also just the shift in their role as learners. You know, for a lot of them went to high schools where they thought their role as a learner was to show up. You know, sit in the class, the teacher is going to tell me what it is I'm supposed to know. I'll write it down. In about 2 weeks, the teacher is going to ask me what they told me, and the fidelity with which I can write down what they told me means I learned. Yay! And so now this idea of, one of my goals for these environments actually is to have a student dashboard. I don't have a student dashboard yet that I'm willing to use with students because I don't think the modeling is good enough yet. But my goal is to have a student dashboard where I would say to the class, okay, before we meet next week, these are the sort of 6 outcomes I want you to achieve. And your homework is turn your dashboard green before you go to class. You know, and so it's no longer read chapter this, do this, you know, or do this number of problems. You know, I don't care how many you do. Just convince my system that you got it, and then we're ready. You know? And that shifts that relationship, shifts the responsibility more. And so what I try to do with my students is, you know, you're responsible for co-creating your learning experience, and you know, I'm a resource, the online thing's a resource, your peer's a resource, everybody's a resource, and we're here to support you to do it. But ultimately, the shift between high school and here is it's yours. You know? And what's also interesting is faculty course evaluations. No one's asked about that yet. And a lot of faculty who started using the online environment, their course evaluations actually went down. And when you read the written comments, it's because the students would say things like, the teacher's not teaching me. They're expecting me to teach myself. And so what I always talk to faculty about if you're going to start shifting this responsibility, this role responsibility, is to be extremely explicit about it. So that the students don't just see it as, oh, you're just trying to shirk your responsibility so you can go do your research. That there is a value in why we're co-owning the learning experience. And in faculty that actually keep framing it that way, then it goes back up again. So, anyway.
It sounds like you might have been using the same course evaluation and that it maybe needed to be changed.
Yeah,
Questions
and
that-
Stanford actually just put in a whole new faculty course evaluation system, which I like a lot better. It went from 36 questions to 12.
Oh, that's a good one.
Which is a start. And the first question, which is about, has a generic question about how much did you learn or something like that. I mean, it's a silly first question, but they made it kind of a silly first question because every faculty member has a period of time where you can go in and customize that first question. And how you're supposed to customize it is you're supposed to write, 4 to 10 learning outcomes that you would hope your students would have been able to achieve by taking your course. And then the rating scale is the student rating, how well do I think I can perform on that outcome. So it is more aligned with kind of that.
So you evaluate learning instead of performance, and I think when they respond to the teaching thing, it's like the performance I learned to expect from my high school. Now your performance is disappointing me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I'm aware we're way past time, so I don't want to make people feel like they're held hostage here. But I'm happy to hang around and really hear your thoughts on this and engage in conversation. Thank you.